بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف خلق الله سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Well, I'm really delighted to be here with you in this afternoon, but allow me at the beginning to acknowledge the presence of my very good friend and colleague, Senator Dr. Muhammad Noor Manouti. I'm really very glad that he is here with us this afternoon. And I was supposed to speak, I guess, in Bahasa Melayu, but I'm not that good in learning languages. So I'm really sorry for this very interesting, I guess, audience this afternoon, not to speak in the language that they know well, but to borrow a language which I don't know well as some, perhaps among the audience, might not be comfortable listening to me speaking in English. But that's out of necessity. Now, the organization or the structure of my presentation is going to follow this sequence. First, I'll have an introduction, and then I focus on from specific rulings to the objectives of the Sharia. And I would deal with this issue of taf'ilu Maqasid Al-Shari. And then the second point would be the Sharia system, where I'll be focusing on these issues: the ethics of action, the ethics of intention within the ummatic framework. And point number 4 will be about Maqasid Al-Sharia and political reform. And point number 5 will be the application of Maqasid Al-Sharia in public policy. And then finally, I'll have a number of concluding remarks. I would start my introduction by telling you about the history of the development of the Sharia sciences, from which Maqasid al-Sharia is one of these sciences. And the first, perhaps, point I would like to highlight in this regard is the fact that fiqh has been developed before usul al-fiqh. And this does have a theoretical implication, as Imam al-Shatibi said. It is because of the fact that 2 centuries after the maturation and development of fiqh, we, the ulama of Islam, started to reflect on maqasid, started to reflect on the principles of Islamic jurisprudence. Whereas it was supposed to be the other way around. It was supposed to be, you should have articulated the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, and then by the help of these principles, then you can derive the specific rulings. But in the history of this science, it was the other way around. It happened that we had first the fiqh schools, and then later on each school developed its own usul. And the theoretical implication of this is that now the usul no longer will govern the fiqh, but the usul is an aftermath reflection on the existing fiqh. And therefore, when there are disagreements between the different schools, you're not going to resort to the principles of Islamic jurisprudence. because each and every school does have its own principles of Islamic jurisprudence. And therefore, Sheikh Tahir ibn Ashur suggested that the way out of this, to resolve disagreements once and for all, we've got to work out Maqasid Al-Sharia. So Maqasid Al-Sharia would do that function of resolving the disagreements between the fuqaha. It cannot be done by the principles of Usul al-Fiqh. Now, the second point in this regard, I would like to say that Maqasid al-Sharia, from being part of the discussion of, excuse me, I have to use my eyeglasses. From being part of the discussion on maslaha or al-istidlal al-mursal to a full-fledged science. Now, it was there when the different ai were talking about the principles of Islamic jurisprudence and the rulings that would govern the acts of the mukallafin, and obviously the great ai like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, I mean all these great ai of Islam, the idea of maqasid was there. It was not spelled out. It was there in their understanding. But later on, when the needs actually come, our scholars developed Maqasid al-Sharia as a full-fledged science on its own. And the book of Sheikh Tahir ibn Ashur, Maqasid al-Sharia, which has been translated by my colleague, is a case in point. Now, the third point is that if you look into the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun, you will realize that the classification of Islamic sciences, there in that classification which we had in the Muqaddimah, Maqasid al-Sharia was completely absent. When he was talking about the sciences of jurisprudence and the development of sciences of jurisprudence, he never touched on this issue of Maqasid al-Sharia. Though at that time, Imam Shatibi and before him Imam Ghazali, they talked about Maqasid al-Sharia. But when he was giving a narrative on the classification of Islamic sciences, he talked about fiqh and usul al-fiqh and ikhtilaf and all these sciences which are connected with Islamic jurisprudence, but he never touched on Maqasid al-Sharia. And that's also is very significant for us to reflect upon. Finally, I should say that in understanding this topic and the history of the development of Maqasid al-Sharia, one has to keep in mind the relationship between fiqh and the state. And in this regard, the thesis of Hassan al-Turabi, may Allah bless his soul, is very important. We've got to keep in mind that fiqh developed not under the influence of the state. The ulama decided to develop fiqh on their own. Very few fuqaha were connected with the state. And therefore, fiqh was devoid from the help of the state. Fiqh was not becoming interested in public issues and public policies, but rather fiqh in its history developed in such a way that would focus on one concern, which is the acts of the mukallaf. Now, with this history, I would like to bring you to this issue which contemporary Muslim scholars actually felt it is important to look into, which they call it Taf'il Maqasid al-Sharia. And instead of talking about Maqasid Al-Sharia, the types of the Maqasid and how it developed, and the thing that I said at the beginning of my lecture, of my presentation. Now, the contemporary Muslim scholars are very much interested in seeing how these maqasid can be realized at the level of the individual, the society, or at the political level, or at the ummatic level. And I would like to draw your attention to this important statement that I'll be making, that public policy arena or public policy area does not have specific rulings, but rather a set of general guidelines and values. So whenever we are connecting Maqasid Al-Sharia with public policy, we've got to keep in mind that there aren't many specific rulings in this regard, but rather we have general public guidelines and values that needed to be realized. In our history, obviously, great scholars like Abu Yusuf, because he was a jurist and a qadi at the same time, connected with the state, he was the first, I guess, to realize the values of Islam in public policies, and his book, Al-Kharaj, is very much into this. In addition to him, perhaps, a Shafi'i jurist like Al-Imam Al-Mawardi and his works on Al-Siyasa Al-Shar'iyya is a case in point. So here we have two great Muslim scholars actually who contributed a great deal in making these general guidelines and values realized in a concrete public policies at their time. And since then, you know, we didn't have actually any kind of significant work that we can refer to. We have bits and pieces here and there. Now, because of this also, a contemporary Muslim scholars like Jamaluddin al-Atiyah gave a proposal for the development of public policy area. And he emphasized that there are two levels to be looked into. The first level, which is the organizational level, which will be governed by the constitution and the relevant rules and regulations. And this means public policy at this level is going to be part and parcel of fiqhi activity tasks. Obviously, Maqasid Al-Sharia is not going to be part and parcel of this level. The organizational level will not be touched by the Maqasid Al-Sharia part. But Maqasid Al-Sharia will be relevant on the second level with both planning and the execution of these plans, or actually putting the plans into action. And at this level, Maqasid Al-Sharia is going to be very much very much relevant, and it will provide us with the guiding principles and values. If you would like to have a public policy, Jamaluddin Atiyah would tell us, if you want to realize the values of Maqasid Al-Sharia, these are the important things you need to keep in mind. First, that the public policy or the plan that you are going to make should be universal and holistic. It should have a universal and holistic vision, which will be part and parcel of the vision of Islam. And second, it should be guided by the values of Islam, which are universal values, and it should be guided also by spirituality, and it should touch on the social cost on each and every public policy you're going to articulate. And finally, it should be governed by a clear system of priorities. It means these priorities have got to be connected with the values of Islam, which, as I said, according to Jamal al-Din Atiyah also, these are universal values. I mean, Islamic values in this regard should be considered as universal values and should not be only for Muslims, but rather for Muslims and non-Muslims, and it should have that humanistic dimension in them. Now, it is important also to keep in mind that the Sharia system have to grapple with these important elements, that the human being have got to have an act which is governed by the ethics and values of Islam. The act itself, when it has been realized, it should be governed and reflecting the values of Islam. And at the same time, it should be governed by the correct intention. We all know that Maqasid Al-Sharia would also focus on this level of the intention of the mukallaf. But at the same time, both the ethics of intention and ethics of action should be seen from within the ummatic framework, and beyond the ummatic framework, the humanistic framework, which will include the ummah and others. So this ethics of action and ethics of intention is not about mere compliance, and it's not about ethics of consequence, but rather it is about genuine application and realization of the universal values which are considered as Islamic values. So this actionalism and ummatism have got to be calculated within a system that would recognize the benefits and harms within, as I said, a very complex system of the level of the ummah as well as the level of humanity at large. Now, concerning this issue of Maqasid Al-Sharia and political reform, because this cannot be done without a political reform. So the required political reform starts with the educational system and the understanding of ijtihad. Now, we cannot talk about Maqasid Al-Sharia when it comes to the application of Maqasid Al-Sharia in public policies. This has to be connected with the educational system and development of understanding of ijtihad. Ijtihad at the personal level, at the political level, at the social level, at the universal level as well. And that has to be part and parcel of the educational reform. I mean, the political reform. Prior to it, there should be an educational reform. And this will focus on the political actors and their position in this reform. Now, we cannot speak about public policy and Maqasid Al-Sharia without touching on the reform of our educational system, without inculcating the values of Islam in that system, without giving special attention to political actors and making them part and parcel of that educational reform. Finally, the application of Maqasid Al-Sharia in public policy would include the level of understanding of Maqasid Al-Sharia, its kinds. There are so many kinds of Maqasid Al-Sharia, different kinds of the Maqasid. These all has to be understood when we are drafting any kind of public policy. And also, one have to keep in mind the priorities, and these priorities are going to be governed by the following parameters. First, the strengths of the maqsad itself, the way it has been derived from the Sharia, from the Quran and Sunnah, and then the universality, the degree of universality of the maqsad, and then finally the certainty of the maqsad. Having this theoretical understanding in mind, I would like to draw your attention to the areas, the relevant areas of public policy connected with Maqasid Al-Sharia. Obviously, it has to be interested in political stability. You cannot have any Maqasid Al-Sharia or any kind of speak or talk about Maqasid Al-Sharia if you have political turmoil. So political stability and ways and means of cementing that political stability is a very important area for us to look into if we are having a discourse on Maqasid Al-Sharia. And second, international relations. You cannot have an isolated understanding of Maqasid Al-Sharia and make it localized. It should transcend the state, the federal, and it should be at the international arena as well. Third, it should focus on economics. It should focus on economic growth. It should focus on inflation, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and exchange rate, etc., etc. It cannot be speak about politics without getting into economics as well. And then it has to include the social cost of any type of planning. We've got to keep in mind the social cost, spirituality, and values of the community in which this public policy is going to be implemented. And then, as I said at the beginning, this is not to speak about a local Muslim community, but rather it's about the Ummah, it's about humanity at large. Finally, I would like to end, within the time stipulated for me. Finally, in my concluding remarks, I would like to refresh your memories by drawing your attention to the following. First, that the Sharia system is for universality of ethics. Now, Muslim ethics are not only meant for Muslims. And let me be provocative in this regard by saying Islam is not meant for Muslims. Islam is meant for whole humanity. So our articulation and realization of Islamic values have got to be a realization and articulation of values which are universal in nature. And the Sharia system, throughout its history, was very rational type of law. So it should not be reduced into a dogma, a number of dogmatic principles that is take it or leave it. I'm not here touching on the permanent aspects of the Sharia. But I'm saying that even the permanent aspects of the Sharia are very rational in nature. In a nutshell, when we are speaking about the Sharia, we are speaking about a system which is universal and rational as well. And the process of calculation of benefit, when we are speaking about Maqasid Al-Shari, actually we are speaking about the calculation of benefits and harms. So the process of calculating these benefits and harms is complex. We have got to understand that. And therefore, that process necessitates both sound character, those who are going to carry out this mission of public policies, implementing Maqasid Al-Sharia in public policies, they've got to have sound character. So the processes in which we are going to elect them, we've got to look in that aspect. And in addition to this, there should be a rigorous training for these political actors. And finally, I would conclude by saying that there is a dire need for professional political ethics. I know, whenever you're speaking about ethics to politicians, they will laugh at you. But if we are going to bring in Maqasid Al-Sharia into public policy, we've got to have that set of professional ethics in place. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.